Arati Prabhakar, a first-generation immigrant, she was the first woman to earn a PhD in applied physics from Caltech, going on to rise to the highest levels of government. Prabhakar has shaped some of America's biggest tech decisions, from leading DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to serving as President Biden's top technology advisor, working on everything from advanced chips to early mRNA vaccine research to the future of artificial intelligence. Since leaving the White House, she is focusing on protecting public research and AI safety. A 2025 CNBC Changemaker, Arati Prabhakar is in the Changemakers and Power Players spotlight. Arati, thank you so much for joining us here for this Changemakers and Power Players podcast. I last saw you in person at the Milken Global Summit, where I got to interview you about all of the tech policy initiatives you were working on. At the time, you were in President Biden's cabinet, and you were his technology advisor, also running one of the organizations. You had previously run DARPA. You've had an incredible career. Before we get into your journey, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since you came back to Palo Alto after Biden left office.
Well, thanks for the chance to talk again, Julia. It's wonderful to be here in San Francisco with you. I came home from the White House in January, moved back home to Palo Alto, just feeling really grateful for the chance to serve my country yet again. Happy to be home. And I'm very worried about where we are in the country, and the place where I think I can make a contribution to getting us back on the right track is about the science and technology system that is so vital to our country's thriving, and it's at risk today. And my work has been standing up for publicly funded research.
So you've been focused on this issue. Tell us how you've been doing that.
Well, a variety of ways. I found myself submitting an amicus brief to one of the many lawsuits that's underway. Mine is not about the constitutional issues, of which there are many, but mine is actually explaining that if you don't have the rule of law, you don't get to have publicly funded research. And without that, you don't get to have national security and better health and prosperity and economic opportunity. And it was something I've taken for granted my whole life, that we would have the rule of law and be able to have this orderly process that feeds the research, that feeds our future. But it's all nothing. You can't take anything for granted anymore. And it was meaningful to me to be able to say that.
Yeah, I was really struck by our conversation years ago now by how you really see technology and now AI as being central, not just for these tech companies here in San Francisco, but for things like health, for things like cybersecurity. And when you were working with the president, you were really pushing some initiatives around AI. What was your approach then around AI, and how have things changed just in the past year or so?
Well, there's a lot going on with AI. I think for many people, it burst on the scene in the fall of 2022. I had just gotten to the White House. It certainly got a lot of attention in Washington starting at that time. I had been at DARPA in the Defense Department a decade earlier, and back then, this is 2012 to 17, we were already using AI for so many different things, for autonomous missions on ships, and for changing how we manage the radio spectrum so we could get more bandwidth for wireless systems. So AI wasn't new to me, but then, of course, all of a sudden it was right in front of us with chatbots and image generation.
And generative AI. It was really, AI for so long was used just for data analysis.
Yeah, it was behind the screen. And then all of a sudden it felt like we were interacting directly with it. I think that's exactly the change that happened. So I think we have some real work to do. I know the market will sort out all kinds of business productivity applications. I want those productivity enhancements. They have to be done in ways that protect privacy, that don't embed discrimination in these critical systems about who gets a loan and who gets housing and how criminal justice works. We can't have it exacerbate fraud. So we've got some real work to do to make sure that it doesn't create a bunch of problems. But I'm pretty sure the market is going to find the business productivity applications. The thing I'm excited about is what's beyond that. What are the things that could really change our lives? And here I'm thinking about AI that's trained not on language, but trained on biological data in ways that could change how quickly we can develop new drugs, or AI that's trained on sensor data in the atmosphere that could change how good our weather forecasts are, or using AI to actually close the educational gaps among our kids. I mean, these are just game-changing possibilities, but we aren't really getting after them. And that's, again, it comes right back to we've got to get back on track as a country and renew this bipartisan commitment that we've had to doing the investments in research for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I talked to people on Capitol Hill about the desire for AI regulation and this idea that social media wasn't regulated until it was too late. And there was no reform of Section 230, but now is the time to regulate AI. And though there is interest in regulating AI from both sides, still hasn't happened yet. And there's a lot of question about how it should be done. Whenever I talk to people about AI regulation, they say, well, we don't want to overregulate because then we'll fall behind China. What's your perspective on that?
My view is that if you ask the American people, which polling has done over and over again, we get a very consistent message, which is in the United States, people are still more fearful than excited about AI. They are excited. They see the possibilities, but they are still more fearful. And people are smart. They saw how jobs went overseas when we didn't deal with the changes as trade globalized, as automation came to manufacturing. And they have seen what social media has done. Yes, it connected us to our family and friends, but yes, it also created this horrible polarization. It's created mental health issues for our kids. And people know that if we just do more of that with AI, that's not the future that we want to live in. So to me, getting the guardrails in place and doing the policy work that goes along with this push from the market, that's how we can get to a good place. But right now, we haven't been able to get that done. And I think it really, to me, it reflects more the lack of ability in our hyper-partisan environment that we're in, our lack of ability to come together and do the things that many people on both sides of the aisle know need to get done.
Yeah. How concerned are you about job losses and the need for upskilling? I mean, we see these companies here in San Francisco provide tools to really replace workers in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Well, you can't just say it's going to be a rosy tomorrow if we just have productivity enhancements, because that translates to fewer jobs, different kinds of jobs, and it can fuel economic growth. It can ultimately come out well, but it doesn't happen magically. And we don't in this country have a good track record of helping people through these transitions. I'll tell you something I've been thinking about. You know how we have seen job loss in manufacturing, and people have really made the important observation that for so many people, it was not just the loss of a job, it was the loss of an identity. And I am starting to see that happening with coding. Software engineers for whom job prospects have shifted and the kinds of work is going to be different. But also, I think a loss of identity for many of them because they loved doing that work, and it's getting displaced and changed in really startling ways quickly with AI.
You've been an advocate for equity and technology as a democratizing force. How concerned are you about gender and racial equity gaps growing because of AI?
Listen, this is a technology tool like every technology tool before in the history of humankind. The whole ballgame is how do we choose to use it? And we can use it to lift everyone up and to do a better job and make better choices than we've made in the past. But that won't happen if we just train it on the imperfect decisions of our past and then just, you don't want to just ramp up doing the things that didn't make sense before. That's not a good outcome if that's what we just let AI do.
I want to shift gears to your incredible story. You came, your family moved to Texas when you were 3 years old, immigrated from India, and you grew up in Texas and went to college very young and went on to graduate school and had a successful career in VC and then have gone back and forth to work for the government. How did you get from being a young immigrant to going off and having this successful career in science and technology?
Well, as with so many of us, my story really starts with my mom, who in 1961, young mother, the first woman in her family in India to go to school outside the home. I mean, any school outside the home. And she went on to get a bachelor's and 2 master's degrees in India. She was working as a social worker. And she brought our family here because she wanted to go to graduate school. She went to the University of Chicago initially, got a master's in social services administration. there are very few women in 1961 who pick up and move themselves and their families from India. So I came from a family where, to my mother, it was just like, well, this was the right thing to do. And so off we go. And so I was raised she started sentences with when you get a PhD. And I think for a lot of kids that could be a problem. I embraced that and it was fine. But in the middle of getting my PhD, I realized that what I really care, I love science and technology, not for their own sake, but because you can grab them and use them to make a better tomorrow. And that's what it's all about for me. And so I left the academic track. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I went to Washington for a congressional fellowship for a year. And I think most people who end up getting to have fun, interesting careers often leave the track that they were supposed to be on, and then they find all kinds of new things open up. And that's what happened for me. For me, that moment came when I was still quite early in my career. I got the chance to go to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Defense Department, as a program manager. And I just fell in love with the idea that there was a place to stand to change the world, to change your field, to change how the world might unfold in the years ahead. And you got to do it for your country. And I never really got over that idea. It was just so thrilling to me.
So you're truly a change maker, and you love that idea of driving change. And so many of the change makers we've interviewed have talked about their nonlinear career path. And a lot of finding their way on that path was about people who gave them advice and just seizing the opportunity that was in front of them, even if it wasn't what they imagined. To whom or to what do you credit your ability to find this path?
I got so much great advice along the way. I had a wonderful advisor when I was in graduate school. A lot of people at Caltech, where I got a PhD, thought of science as an end in itself. They thought of a PhD as a thing that puts you on a forever track to be an academic. I had a wonderful advisor who realized it could also be a door that, it could open doors to do all kinds of other things. And that was, when you're young and these are the mentors that really matter to you. So I think there are many pivotal moments like that. I keep coming back to my mom. She's the one who made it okay to be the only person who looked like me in the room. She's the one who made it okay to do something that almost every career change I've made, the people I was leaving thought I was crazy. Like it just didn't make sense to them. But somehow I knew it was going to be okay because I was chasing a dream I had.
And really chasing your dream. I mean, I think it's interesting that you'll be able to integrate your mother's dream that, of course, you're going to get a PhD. I wonder what my kids would say if I started sentences, well, when you get your PhD. But you were able to integrate that this was something you were going to do and you were capable of doing these hard things, but also you could make it make sense for you and what you were passionate about. And taking it outside of academia.
I think we all find our passion, right? You don't know when you're an 18-year-old kid what it's going to be. Now I can look back and I can tell you that every change I made was because I wanted to use science and technology to change people's lives in the future. But I wouldn't have known to tell you that at 18 and 25 and 30. Now I see it.
So you were often the only person who looked like you in a room, in a classroom, in an office setting. Why were you not intimidated?
Oh, that goes back to when I was in school in Lubbock, Texas, and we moved to Lubbock in 1970. I was 11, and at that time, if you said, someone said, "Where are you from?" I'd say I'm Indian, and they would ask which tribe because they knew more Native Americans than they knew people from India. There were so few Indian families at that time, and but it was fine. People were accepting, and I felt nourished by my community and able to do whatever I wanted. And I was raised to believe that we should take the best from our culture, but seize the best of the environment and the culture that we were in as well. So somehow, for me, I was pretty far along in my career before I was in rooms with other people who looked like me or had backgrounds like me. Maybe I'm not really sure that happened until the Biden administration, where that White House, the president cared and he made sure it was true. That White House looked like America. It really did. But, before that, I was in venture capital. I was in the Defense Department. I was getting a PhD at Caltech back in the 80s. Those were not places where you saw a lot of people who looked like me at all. And it was fine. I cared about the work. I found people I loved working with. And that ability to just stay focused on what matters has served me, I think, very, very well.
Yeah. What would your advice be to people who are maybe in a minority or women in a male-dominated environment for how not to feel imposter syndrome or not to get intimidated?
You have to start by recognizing that you belong there. You're bringing something to the work that needs to be done. You're pursuing something that matters to you. And other people sometimes can get confused about that, but you don't have to get confused about that. And if others get confused, that's really their problem.
I like that. If they're confused, maybe you can clarify for them. Someone described you as having a lot of moxie.
I've been called worse than that.
That's a good thing. I think moxie is a good thing. What did you learn from your experience working in venture capital that you've brought to the private sector?
I got so much value from seeing the public side of funding research and driving technology and then turning it into products and profits and businesses. I came to Silicon Valley originally in 1997 because I wanted to see that. When you're doing research, you're pushing on a noodle, and I wanted to see what it was like on the other side. How did you pull technology forward? And I learned so much, both from the companies I worked in and then a decade in early stage venture. I think the great privilege of venture capital is that you get to work with entrepreneurs who have these big dreams and are willing to just go for it. And that's always amazing. That's a great experience to get to back people like that.
And then how do you bring that attitude of these great dreams and huge ambitions and willingness to take big swings to drive change and bring that to the government?
Yeah. Well, I got to do that in government. In fact, the biggest swings I ever got to take were in government in my case. But I'll tell you what's very different is when you're doing it in government, what you do for the public funding of research, you are starting something. You're not going to get it across the finish line. The work I did at DARPA originally was on advances in semiconductor technology.
And what year was this?
A long
time ago.
86 to 93 was my first tour at DARPA. That was all about how do you shrink electronics for radios and chips. And of course, there were commercial drivers, but there were things that the military needed that were very, that caused us to make really aggressive research bets. And I'll tell you something, every time I look at my smartphone, I think about the lithography on those chips that I helped make happen. I think about the chip that's transmitting to the radio tower. That's technology that I got to work on. And seeing it manifest in the commercial world is delightful and satisfying. But I also got to hear a soldier talk one day about what he packed in his backpack when he went on patrols. And what he took was comms gear and navigation gear. He said it was more essential to his survival than food or water. And we did the research that made those devices small enough that he could carry it around and do this incredibly hard mission that he does for all of us. So, the only benefit of getting old is you get to see how those stories turn out, and it's very, very meaningful. So that the job in the public sector was to light the spark, create those new possibilities. In venture capital, you're building companies that are going to build real products that get into, chips that go into smartphones or new battery management that goes into devices. And that's satisfying too, because it doesn't matter if you light a spark if it doesn't actually turn into something real. So for me, the great fun of it is I just know this country can do huge things. I've gotten to be part of some of them, and I just see it. I know we can do it. I know we have done it. We have to keep doing it. And I see how important it is to have public and private each doing their part.
Yeah, the partnerships. I read something that you said about this idea of the scientific work, and I think this really reflects your decision not to be an academic, but that it's not enough to do the work, that you have to fight for it. And I wonder how this idea of doing the work and then bringing it to fruition, how this ties into your idea about the importance of these long-term investments.
Yeah.
Because this idea that 35 years ago, you were working on chip development, and now that chip development is essential for AI and so many things going on in our economy, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, it's very satisfying to see. And it doesn't happen by accident. I think we have a little bit of a fairy tale in which you do the science and then magic happens. But you really can't wait around for the magic to happen. maybe another good way to illustrate it, when I showed up at DARPA, I worked at DARPA early in my career, left for 19 years, came back in 2012 as the director. And when I came in 2012, think about that, years before the pandemic, I walked in the door and one of my program managers said, he was an infectious disease doc and an Air Force colonel, and he said, there's going to be another pandemic. All the conditions are right. People in that world knew that. The rest of us were in blissful ignorance. And he said, one of the problems is it takes years or decades or never to make a vaccine. But there's this research in mRNA, and it could be the basis for a rapid response vaccine platform. An idea that was crazy back then. It's hard to imagine now, but it really was. Just people thought it was naive and silly. And then my program manager went on to say, I just met a company called Moderna. They're working on mRNA for cancer, but we might be able to persuade them to work on infectious disease, which was that's not a very solid market, right, if you're an investor. And to me, so what happened is we did the work with Moderna, many other players in the community, built the field, and the work that we did led to the first human trials, clinical trials of mRNA vaccines. This is way before COVID happened. It was for prior diseases. But once we saw humans demonstrate, people actually showed an immune response. All of a sudden, people said, wait a minute, this might not be a completely crazy idea. And so we went from it's impossible to it might be possible about 2017. Thank goodness, because that was part of getting the fastest, safe and effective vaccines ever during the pandemic itself.
And so having had that experience and reflecting on how much people around you knew, but the rest of the world didn't know, what is your message now about the importance of taking a long-term view around planning and leadership?
You need it. We have to be making the investments today for the next 10 and 20 and 30 years. And you need the whole thing. And that's what this country has been so great at, is planting those early seeds, but also having a robust and vibrant market that can take brand new PhDs coming out of graduate school and who can start a company and then not only build a company, but ultimately build industries. We've got the whole package, and I just want to make sure we keep all of that going because it's part of our role in the world.
I'm curious to learn how you have evolved as a leader, because you've led all sorts of different organizations, and Changemakers change themselves over their careers. What kind of a leader are you now?
Well, I think when I first got management responsibility, of course, in your head that it's all about the people. But I don't think you really understand it in your heart and your soul until you've done it for a little while. And as life unfolds, of course, the hardest part of doing anything and the most worthwhile part of doing anything is the people that you get to do it with. And those people issues have been the most sleepless nights across all of my management time, but also the greatest glow I feel. Everything I feel like I've gotten to contribute to, what makes me happy was the fact I got to do it with such stellar people. And the moments I remember are when we're sitting around the table and we're having a laugh together because we see that we're making progress on something. I think it's just, you really come to feel it in your heart and your soul about how enriching it is to get to work with people and do big things.
So what's your advice when it comes to hiring? How should leaders think about hiring the best teams?
Well, all the obvious things about hiring are important. Do people have the right skills? Can they work together with the team? The thing I always looked for that was more important than all of those to me was, did people have an ethical core? And because to me, that is how you treat people, how you recognize your role in the world. If you're in the business of building powerful technologies, which has been my business forever, part and parcel of that is you're going to be seeing the power of new science and technology capabilities before the rest of the world does. You're going to see them in the lab. And part of the responsibility that comes with that great joy is starting to think about what the implications are going to be, what the ethical implications are going to be, whether it's neurotechnology, whether it's AI and automation, whether it's privacy issues. And grappling with that is something that to me, you really can't do it if you don't have that ethical core. So I think that's got to be part of it.
I've heard that you have a mantra of failing fast. That seems like a very scientific approach. Try to fail fast. You can, eliminate options, then move forward.
Yeah.
But what does that mean to you to fail fast?
Well, my daughters always roll their eyes because they've heard it since they were kids. But I always say fail early and often. And I'll tell you, it's true because you want to try things, and when they don't work, you want to move to the next thing. So yes, it's part of being experimental and driving to something that works. But it's a personal philosophy too. And I'll tell you, it's rooted in the fact that when I was still young in my career, maybe in my 30s, I saw so many people who had always been successful, had risen to middle management and senior management roles in companies. And that wave of automation with computing and information technologies was happening. I'm talking 90s, 2000 time period. And people who had never failed at anything were out of a job in their 40s and 50s. And they didn't know how to recover from that. I failed early and often. I stumbled so many times. When I went to graduate school, I was utterly unprepared for the academic rigor of Caltech and, quantum mechanics in this institution where Einstein once walked the halls, right? And it was horrible failing. There was terrible stumbling and stubbing my toe, but it was such a good experience to know that I could get through that and revector and figure out what I needed to do. And I learned the quantum mechanics, but more importantly, I figured out where to aim myself at the things where I could succeed.
Does it also make you less risk averse because you're not as afraid of failure?
Yes, I think that's right, because you know that, it's okay to try something, and if you keel over, you get up and try again.
What are your other key leadership principles?
I don't have anything magic to say. People have been so thoughtful about what it takes to lead organizations, and I think if you love people enough to work with them through all the hard things and do big things together, I don't think there's anything that's more satisfying than that.
What do you think is the best advice you've ever gotten?
What's the best advice? In my era, when I was going through college, there were so many efforts to try to encourage women because we were even sparser back then in technical fields. And I remember people would always come up with all kinds of advice. The one piece of advice that really stuck with me was a woman who said, you just have to marry well. And it's really true, because if you're going to form a partnership with someone for your whole life, that's going to shape everything. And if you have someone who can understand why you are passionate about your work and who can support you in that, that's the whole ballgame. I'm lucky enough I met my husband because he was the Senate staffer who managed my confirmation hearing in 1993. So the world's nerdiest meet cute in Washington. But what that meant is that when we had lived in California for 15 years, thinking we would always live in California, we had 2 teenage girls, and I got the call to ask if I would come back and run DARPA. He just looked at me and he said, I guess we're about to pick up and move. And, having someone who understands how important public service and that particular role was to me, it was pretty wonderful.
Yeah, it's funny. The advice to marry well does not seem like it would actually be about equity. It's really about a partnership as opposed to finding a man to take care of you or whatever the old cliche is.
Exactly. It's not the kind of marry well so you get jewelry.
Yeah. Marry well so you have a good partner.
Right.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I'm just curious if you have any sort of life hacks. You have had so many incredibly stressful, high-powered jobs. You have kids. You've moved across the country and worked in all sorts of different environments. Do you have any secrets? Any tips to get you through those stressful moments?
Maybe this is the other piece of good advice I got, because again, it's something someone told me. It's so hard to balance all the parts of your life that you care about your personal life, your friends, your family, and then the work that you're passionate about. It's really hard to balance that every day or every week. But if you think about it in, seasons or a period of time that's long enough that all the bumps can wash out.
I try to think about it in a month.
That's
I can have balance in a month, then I'm in good shape.
That's probably about the right unit. That's exactly.
And do you ever get burnt out?
Yeah.
What do you do to recharge?
These days I'll go listen to a podcast of someone who I think is calm and inspiring, and sort of get me back on track. I go back and I think about the good things that right now I'm very worried about my country, and that can get me down. But the way I reboot for that is I look at what we've been able to accomplish, and I look at our history, or I go read something about, what Abraham Lincoln brought this country through. And it helps me recommit and realize that people always rise, and we're going to rise again.
We're going to rise again is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for
Thank
this
you, Julia.
conversation and your time.